Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut is a place where art and nature flourish together, just as the family that designed this estate intended. Hillstead is a colonial revival house built at the turn of the 20th century and maintained today just as it was when the family that built it lived here. Hillstead is their outstanding art collection. Hillstead is 150 acres of fields, trails, and scenic views. Hillstead is May Market and other seasonal events for the whole family. Hillstead is also a beautiful sunken garden, the site of the annual Sunken Garden Poetry Festival. This program and the ones that follow are an invitation to you to attend this summer's series of poetry and music events. Mimi Madden is the festival's artistic director.
If you're one of those people who encountered poetry back in high school and found it dull or obscure, you should try visiting Hillstead Museum on a summer evening and experience poetry in a whole new way. Every other week in the summer, hundreds of people converge at this beautiful estate in Farmington, Connecticut to hear some of the best poets in the country read poetry that is relevant and accessible. Audiences love the informality and outdoor setting of the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival. You can bring lawn chairs or blankets, pack a picnic, or buy dinner and wine from the festival vendors. There's an hour of live music first, anything from jazz to folk to classical. And then you can hear some of America's foremost poets read their work in the quiet of a summer's evening. The festival's ongoing popularity is evidence that poetry still holds an important place in American culture, and that poetry has a unique power to remind us of our common humanity. For this series of television programs, we have selected readings from the summer of 2012, our 20th anniversary season. We hope they'll give you an idea of what it's like to spend an evening in our garden, and we hope that you'll join us in the summer of 2013 to hear the featured poets. Pulitzer Prize winners Tracy K. Smith and Philip Schultz, the human rights advocate Carolyn Forche, Cuban-American poet Richard Blanco, and the well-known and well-loved Billy Collins.
It's so lovely to be back here for this anniversary year. I have to tell you, 14 years ago when I came here the first time, I didn't even have the prospect of a book. My first book hadn't been taken. I'd published a few poems, and yet Rennie McQuilkin took a chance and invited me here. And it's lovely to get to come back here 14 years later with all that has happened. Because the only official duty that a poet laureate has is to promote poetry to as wide an audience as possible. And so I should start off by thanking this large audience for helping me start off doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Thank you so much for being here and for supporting the Sunken Garden and this wonderful reading series. I like to think of myself as a poet who takes up the burdens of history, and that the burden itself is not really a burden, but a joy, a thing that one carries because you can't not carry it. This is Pilgrimage, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here, the Mississippi carved its mud-dark path, a graveyard for skeletons of sunken riverboats. Here, the river changed its course, turning away from the city as one turns, forgetting from the past. The abandoned bluffs, land sloping up above the river's bend, where now the Yazoo fills the Mississippi's empty bed. Here, the dead stand up in stone, white marble on Confederate Avenue. I stand on ground once hollowed by a web of caves. They must have seemed like catacombs in 1863 to the woman sitting in her parlor, candle lit, underground. I can see her listening to shells explode, writing herself into history, asking what is to become of all the living things in this place. This whole city is a grave. Every spring, pilgrimage, the living come to mingle with the dead, brush against their cold shoulders in the long hallways, listen all night to their silence and indifference, relive their dying on the green battlefield. At the museum, we marvel at their clothes, preserved under glass, so much smaller than our own, as if those who wore them were only children. We sleep in their beds, the old mansions hunkered on the bluffs, draped in flowers, funereal, a blur of petals against the river's gray. The brochure in my room calls this living history. The brass plate on the door reads Prissy's room. A window frames the river's crawl toward the Gulf. In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. Thank you. Thank you. This is a poem from my first book that tries to imagine something about my parents before I was born. One of the things that I can't not tell this story, so if you've heard me tell it, just forgive me or try to act like it's new. But my parents met at Kentucky State College, which was one of the HBCUs, a historically black college or university, back in the 60s. My mother up from Mississippi and my father down from Canada. My father's story is interesting about arriving there because he didn't realize that it was a black college when he got there, but he'd hitchhiked all the way from Canada, so he stayed. Now, this is around the same time that the Righteous Brothers came out with their song, You Lost That Love and Feeling. And my mother and all the women in her dorm loved this song, and they thought, of course, that these soulful-voiced men had to be black. And they gathered around the TV one night because apparently the Righteous Brothers were going to appear on one of the variety shows. And in my mother's story, just at the moment that the Righteous Brothers came on singing You Lost That Love and Feeling, my father jogged by the window. And so you see why I'm here. Early evening, Frankfort, Kentucky. It is 1965. I am not yet born, only a fullness beneath the empire waist of my mother's blue dress. The ruffles at her neck are waves of light in my father's eyes. He carries a slim volume, leather-bound, poems to read as they walk. The long road past the college, through town, rises and falls before them, the blue hills shimmering at twilight. The stacks at the distillery exhale, and my parents breathe evening air, heady and sweet as Kentucky bourbon. They are young and full of laughter, the sounds in my mother's throat rippling down into my blood. My mother, who will not reach 41, steps into the middle of a field, lies down among clover and sweetgrass, right here, right now, dead center of her life. Graveyard Blues. It rained the whole time we were laying her down. Rain from church to grave when we put her down. The suck of mud at our feet was a hollow sound. When the preacher called out, I held up my hand. When he called for a witness, I raised my hand. Death stops the body's work, the soul's a journeyman. The sun came out when I turned to walk away, glared down on me as I turned and walked away, my back to my mother, leaving her where she lay. The road going home was pocked with holes. That home-going road's always full of holes. Though we slow down, time's wheel still rolls. I wander now among names of the dead, my mother's name, stone pillow for my head. This poem formally is a palindrome, like a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Or worse than that, Satan sees Natasha. It's also a poem that relies a little bit on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it's kind of like dreams I have about my mother. I have two kinds of dreams about her. In one kind of dream, I know that she's dead, and the dream always feels like a lovely visitation, and I wake up and I feel happy to have seen her. In the other kind of dream, I don't know that she's gone or that anything has happened, and so there's always that moment of realization upon waking and opening my eyes that she's gone, which of course must have been like what Orpheus felt, turning around and banishing Eurydice back to the underworld. Myth. I was asleep while you were dying. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow I make between my slumber and my waking, the Erebus I keep you in, still trying not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow, but in dreams you live, so I try taking you back into morning. Sleep heavy, turning, my eyes open, I find you do not follow. Again and again, this constant forsaking. Again and again, this constant forsaking. My eyes open, I find you do not follow. You back into morning, sleep heavy, turning. But in dreams you live, so I try taking, not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying, I make between my slumber and my waking. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow. I was asleep while you were dying. This is sort of a difficult book to write, and I knew that if I could... My father took me to Monticello over 20 years ago, and I had this idea that if I took him back, that I could finish this book. I could write this poem that needed to get written. And you know, some things have changed in the over 20 years since I'd been. I don't know if many of you have gone to Monticello and taken that tour, but there was a time when you took the tour that there was no mention of Sally Hemings. And now, because of Annette Gordon Reed's, Pulitzer Prize and no National Book Award winning books, historians have actually kind of made a statement that now they actually believe that Jefferson fathered some of Sally Hemings' children. So actually the docents now will give that official line when you enter the museum. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed, talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it. This history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you.
I want to go now from a couple of Connecticut poems to read some poems from my last book of poems that came out last September. I felt poetry kind of going from me slowly, and I think it's gone now. That's all right. I mean, I've been writing it for 70 years. What do I expect? The first one I'd like to read is, in a way, it goes back to Hamden. It's called The Things. When I walk in my house, I see pictures bought long ago, framed and hanging. De Koninck, Art, Laurencin, Henry Moore, that I've cherished and stared at for years. Yet my eyes keep returning to the masters of the trivial. A white stone perfectly round, tiny lead models of baseball players, a cowbell, a broken great-grandmother's rocker, a dead dog's toy. Valueless, unforgettable, detritus that my children will throw away, as I did my mother's souvenirs of trips with my dead father, kodaks of kittens, and bundles of cards from my mother Kate. Where I was emptying the house was, of course, Hamden. I spent my summers in New Hampshire, in the house where I live now, with my grandfather and our grandmother. I adored it. And when I grew up, and I thought I could never possibly go back there. And I did go back there. But this poem was written a few years earlier when I knew I could not. It's called Mount Kearsarge, which is, what would be the tiny foothill in the west. It's a mountain that dominates the view from my house. Great Mount Kearsarge, great blue mountain, ghost. I look at you from the porch of the farmhouse where I watched you all summer as a boy. Steep sides, narrow flat patch on top. You are clear to me like the memory of one day. Blue, blue. The top of the mountain floats in haze. I will not rock on this porch when I am old. I turn my back on you, Kearsarge. I close my eyes, and you rise inside me, blue ghost. I'm going to read now something completely different. This is my poem about poetry readings. And it is called To a Waterfowl. Well, waterfowl are done with after the first line or two. Women with hats like the rear ends of pink ducks applauded you, my poems. These are the women whose husbands I meet on airplanes, who close their briefcases and ask, "What are you in?" I look in their eyes. I tell them I am in poetry. And their eyes fill with anxiety and with little tears. "Oh yeah," they say, developing an interest in clouds. "My wife, she likes that sort of thing." "I guess maybe I'd better watch my grammar." I leave them in airports watching their grammar and take a limousine to the Women's Goodness Club, where I drink Harvey's Bristol cream with their wives and eat chicken salad with capers with little tomato wedges. And I read them The Erotic Crocodile and Eating You. When I have concluded the disbursement of my sonorities, crooning high on thy thigh, I cry, "Hi," and so forth. They smile, they spank their wide hands, they smile like jello, and they say, "My goodness, Mr. Hall, but you certainly do have an imagination." "Thank you indeed," I say, "it brings in the bacon." But now my poems. Now I have returned to the motel, returned to l'éternel retour of the Holiday Inn, naked, lying on the bed, watching Godzilla sucks Mount Fuji, addressing my poems, feeling superior, and drinking bourbon from a flask disguised to look like a transistor radio. And what about you? You laughing. You in the blue jeans, laughing at your mother who wears hats, and at your father who rides airplanes with a briefcase watching his grammar. Will you ever be old and dumb like your creepy parents? Not you, not you, not you, not you. And most of what I'm talking about is remembering the old days of the one-horse farmer, which I inhabited, and it was the way farms were in the 19th century, but they were still going in the middle of the 20th, from the old people. Names of horses. All winter your brute shoulders strained against collars, padding in steerheim over the ash hames to haul sledges of cordwood for drying through spring and summer, for the Glenwood stove next winter, and for the simmering range. In April, you pulled cartloads of manure to spread on the fields, dark manure of Holsteins, and knobs of your own clustered with oats. All summer, you mowed the grass in meadow and hayfield, the mowing machine clacketing behind you, while the sun walked high in the morning. And after noon's heat, you pulled a clawed rake through the same acres, gathering stacks, and dragged the wagon from stack to stack, and the built hay rack back uphill to the chaffy barn, 3 loads of hay a day hanging wide from the hay rack. Sundays you trotted the 2 miles to church with the light load of a leather quarter-top buggy, and grazed in the sound of hymns. Generation on generation, your neck rubbed the windowsill on the stall, smoothing the wood as the sea smooths glass. When you were old and lame, when your shoulders hurt bending to graze, one October the man who fed you and kept you and harnessed you every morning led you through corn stubble to sandy ground above Eagle Pond, and dug a hole beside you where you stood shuddering in your skin. and lay the shotgun's muzzle in the boneless hollow behind your ear, and fired the slug into your brain and felled you into your grave, shoveling sand to cover you, setting goldenrod upright above you, whereby next summer a dent in the ground made your monument. For 150 years, in the pasture of dead horses, roots of pine trees pushed through the pale curves of your ribs. Yellow blossoms flourished above you in autumn, and in winter frost heaved your bones in the ground. Old toilers, soil makers, oh, Roger, Mackerel, Riley, Ned, Nellie, Chester, Lady Ghost. This is called Reeds and Peonies. Your peonies burst out, white as snow squalls, with red flecks at their shaggy centers, in your border of prodigies by the porch. I carry one magnanimous blossom indoors and float it in a glass bowl, as you used to do. Ordinary pleasures, contentment recollected, blow like snow into the abandoned garden, overcoming the daisies. Your blue coat vanishes down Pond Road into imagined snowflakes, with Gus at your side, his great tail swinging. But you will not reappear, tired and satisfied, and grief's repeated particles suffuse the air, like the dog yipping through the entire night, or the cat stretching awake, then curling as if to dream of her mother's milky nipples. A raccoon dislodged a geranium from its pot. Flowers, roots, and dirt lay upended in the back garden where lilies begin their daily excursions above stone walls in the season of old roses. I pace beside weeds and snowy peonies, staring at Mount Kearsarge, where you climbed wearing purple hiking boots. Hurry back. Be careful climbing down. Your peonies lean their vast heads westward as if they might topple. Some topple,